Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today are two of my colleagues, Sarah K. Bierle and Doug Crenshaw. And we have today a classic tale of literature for you called The Tale of Two Jacksons. It was the worst of Stonewall. It was the best of Stonewall. Sarah K., how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast. It's been a while, but good to be back.
See, she's sounding so modest. She's like, "Oh, thanks for inviting me." And this is actually her idea. So, Doug, how are you tonight? Sarah, right? Yeah. Doug, how are you tonight?
I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. I think it's a good topic.
Yeah. Glad to have both of you with us. So for me, I'm really interested in this topic because it goes back to a what if question. And I know that sometimes makes people shudder, but they're like, well, what if Jackson came back after his wounding? And everyone assumes you're going to have like the super powerhouse Stonewall Jackson of the Shenandoah Valley. And I remind people like, well, maybe you end up with the Stonewall Jackson of the 7 days, not quite such a powerhouse. And so I thought, let's peel that back and talk about it a little bit and talk about the Jackson of the Valley and the Jackson of the 7 days. And who better to talk about than our 7 days expert, Doug Crenshaw, and our Valley expert, Sarah K. Bierle. So that's where we're going tonight.
All right.
So if someone were to pose, let's start with that question. And Sarah, I'll start with you, and Doug, I'll turn to you. If someone were to pose that question, geez, what if Stonewall had survived his wounding? Which Stonewall Jackson?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think it's one that we have to think about, and we have to think about the time and the place, and we have to think about Jackson himself, where he's at in his leadership arc, if you will. And also we have to think about the men that he's commanding. Where are they at? What is their morale? How are they provided for? How are the supplies, the logistics, those sorts of things? So there's so many things that we have to factor when we ask that question. What if Jackson had survived? What if Jackson is alive beyond Chancellorsville? What's the state of his army? What is he thinking? How hard does he want to push? Has Jackson evolved at all in how he handles sending troops into combat on the offensive side? We certainly see a large scale offensive attack at Chancellorsville, but he's mostly on the defense at Fredericksburg. And, as he has more troops under his command, would he have been sending them piecemeal into fights like we see in the Shenandoah Valley campaign in 62? So I think there's a lot of questions that we have to think about beyond just that, oh my goodness, what if Jackson was there? And I think that kind of ties into how Jackson has been remembered over time, and how he was like this one-man army, and yet there were thousands of men behind Jackson. There was also his staff immediately behind him, and they contribute a lot to his success and sometimes to his challenges and leadership issues as well.
So Doug, let me pitch that over to you. If we're asking this question, what Jackson are we getting? What are the sorts of things you think about?
Well, I think Sarah's right in that it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on, as you'll see when we talk about the 7 days, his physical condition, clarity of orders. Will he be too aggressive? Will he not be aggressive enough? It's an intriguing question, but we can never know the answer.
Yeah, and that's, I think, important too. It's like, and I don't think any of the three of us are going to try to actually answer that question. To me, what's interesting is like, what sorts of things does the question get us start thinking about, and how does it help us evaluate the situation a little bit? And it's important for us to remember we're talking about the Stonewall Jackson of June 1862, where he's leaving and coming to the 7 days, and he's coming from, I think, one of his great successes of the war to probably his low point of the war, and that's a very different Jackson than we see in May of 1863. Sarah, let me my point of the Valley. Why is Jackson, remembered for all this stuff that he does in the Shenandoah Valley of the spring of 62?
Right. So I think one of the things that's important to recognize right from the start with Jackson's Valley campaign in the spring of 1862 is what he accomplishes militarily. And you can't take that away from him. Whether you're a Jackson fan or not, what he accomplishes is impressive. You know, we're talking about marching over 600 miles over a period of a few weeks. He's going to fight 6 pitched battles along with lots of skirmishes along the way. But of those 6 larger battles, he's going to win 5 out of the 6. He's going to send 3 small armies, but armies nonetheless, out of the Shenandoah Valley, leaving that area open for the Confederates to be able to hold on to that supply area. And also, because of these successes that Jackson has in the Valley, that's going to affect the overall strategic picture of the war in the East, because the politicians in Washington, D.C. get really nervous and they're refusing to send McClellan reinforcements as he's on the peninsula trying to get to the gates of Richmond. So there's a lot of things to consider. And I think the way Jackson ties down all of these Union troops, the ones that he is actively maneuvering against and fighting, is important, but also keeping in mind how many troops he's keeping tied to Washington and away from McClellan. And that's something to keep in mind. I think that's one of the big reasons that the Valley campaign is studied. And then, of course, we have memory coming into it a little later, you know, where with hindsight, Jackson defends the Valley so well that he becomes this hero to the civilians, to the soldiers, particularly in that region. And that's going to just build as time goes on, grow more exponentially after he leaves the Valley for the last times. And then, of course, after his death. And looking beyond Jackson in the war in the Shenandoah Valley, there are so many Confederates, both soldier and civilian, who keep looking at the next Confederate commander coming into the Valley and asking, is he the next Jackson? You know, when John C. Breckinridge arrives in the Valley in May of 1864, there's civilians wondering, is this the next Jackson? They're comparing him to this hero who's left such a mark on the military landscape and the memory landscape of war in the Valley.
Yeah. So Doug, and when I asked Doug about participating today, he says, I'll have to do the 7-day stuff. The Valley's not my area of expertise, but I want to ask you, Doug, Jack,
Froze.
I think we lost you there, Chris.
Yeah, you froze, Chris.
All right. Okay. When we, you guys were frozen too here, I'll edit this up together for us.
Okay.
So Doug, when I know you're our 7 days guy, but when you think of Stonewall Jackson in the Valley, what do you think of?
I think about somebody carrying out daring exploits, beating armies larger than his, tying the Union troops down, causing fear even in McClellan, great fear in Washington, an inspiring leader, the great hero of the Confederacy at the time.
I know that a lot of
Sarah nailed it, I think, you know?
Yeah. And I think people who are skeptical of Jackson or are critical of Jackson, they like, well, he's fighting a bunch of B leaders and it's
Right,
the
B team,
Banks,
right?
John, the B team. But I think at that point in the war, nobody knows that that's the B team necessarily. And so, in its moment, there's still pretty exciting and substantial victories, even though as the war progresses and we see that these are leaders who don't necessarily have a whole lot going for them. In the moment, I think that it's really important that Jackson is having these sorts of successes. I think the other bit of context that I think is really important for Jackson at this point has to do with how poorly the Confederacy is doing everywhere else.
I was going there. Yes.
Yeah. Well, Doug, talk about that. Go there.
Well, at this point in the war, the Confederacy has lost Nashville, most of Tennessee. It's lost much of the Mississippi River. It's lost New Orleans. It's lost most of the coast of North Carolina. It's lost Virginia up to Richmond and down to Fredericksburg, and its most esteemed general, Albert Sidney Johnston, was killed. So things are looking very bad indeed when George McClellan is 6 or 7 miles outside of Richmond. So things are looking bad. So Jackson inspires the Confederacy by his victories. He's the only one that seems to be doing anything successful.
And I would like to jump in and point out that in March of 1862, which is when we see the Valley campaign happen, when we see McClellan transfer the Army of the Potomac down to the Virginia Peninsula, Jackson kind of is a B list general. If we're talking about, he goes up against B list generals. Well, he kind of is one at the beginning of the campaign. Yes, he's had his moment of fame at First Manassas in July of 1861, where he got his nickname. But he'd had some leadership problems, and he had had a big conflict with Richmond and the politicians down there in the winter of 62 with the Romney expedition. And people aren't looking at Jackson in March of 1862 the way they're going to look at him even 2 months later in May. So I think that's something to keep in mind. The Confederacy is kind of lacking a hero. And as Doug said, Jackson's going to step into that role very nicely. But it's not like there was something hanging above his head that said, I'm going to be your next hero. When he evacuates Winchester in March 1862, people are mad at him and they do not like him. They do not know why he's doing what he's doing. And perhaps that begins a bit of a trend. No one knows what Jackson's doing, but as time goes on, he pulls out victories, and that brings him to this hero status.
He was famous for saying mystify the enemy, but he mystified his own people often as well.
That's true. He even mystified
too,
Richard Ewell, number 2 in his command chain.
Yeah, Ewell thought he was crazy. And going back to your comment, and this ties into something Doug said as well about, okay, he had his moment at Manassas. Let's look at PGT Beauregard, who also had his moment in Manassas. And what's happening to him in the spring of 62? He's lost the Battle of Shiloh, although it was probably lost as soon as they launched the attack. But he gets saddled with that. And, so how the mighty have fallen. Albert Sidney Johnston, the great hero of the Confederacy, he's dead, so heroes expire pretty quickly in the Confederacy in these early ages. So Jackson's moment in the sun at Manassas certainly doesn't promise anything for later on, as you point out. So he scores these victories in the Shenandoah Valley. Sarah, what would you say is his key characteristic that allows him to achieve that kind of success?
I think Jackson is laser focused. He focuses in on something that needs to be done, and then one way or another, he's going to find a way to do it. Often that includes forgetting to tell everybody else what the plan is, or just deciding that's part of his leadership and I won't tell anyone what I'm doing, including, direct subordinate generals, staff officers. There is a plethora of quotes, even from some of his very loyalist officers. And they're like, we don't know what Jackson's wanting to do, but he would focus in on something. He would decide, this is where we need to go. This is what we need to do. And to allow him to focus, he begins to pull together resources to help him make informed decisions. And I think one thing that we can't discount is the good maps that Jackson has in the Shenandoah Valley. After he retreats, I believe it's after the Battle of Crenshaw on March 23rd, 1862, that Jedediah Hotchkiss, a civil engineer and man who had spent years riding around the Shenandoah Valley for his own fun. He was, he enjoyed looking at rocks. He studied nature. He had a very intimate knowledge of the topography, the roads that existed in the Shenandoah Valley. And Jackson goes to Hotchkiss and says the famous quote, "Make me a map of the valley." And Hotchkiss's map is huge. I think it's like 9 feet, the really large one. I'd have to look that up. Don't quote me on that one, but it's very large. And then Hotchkiss would make these smaller detailed maps. So Jackson's pulling information that's going to help him make decisions that will have war-changing effects to some extent. Jackson will often forget the minor details in the drive to get to his main goal. And I think that's where we see him run an army into the ground, literally, which I think we're going to get to a little later in the discussion. So I don't want to jump there just yet.
Sure. So Doug, she's mentioned 2 things I want you to comment on: laser focus and good maps. Does the Jackson of the 7 days have those tools?
I don't see the laser focus, but the maps are a critical problem. And it's not just for Jackson. It's almost tragic that he didn't bring his map maker with him, because they had no good maps, no accurate maps of the area around Richmond. The main map Lee had was missing some critical features that are going to cost him at Gaines Mill. So the laser focus seems to be off. I don't know how far you want to go into this point, but he's
go right into it. Laser focus in on it.
He's exhausted. I'll buy Robertson's claim and Bob Crick's claim that he was exhausted, because I agree he was. He's fought the campaign in the Valley. He rides his horse all the way to Richmond to meet with Lee and the other generals at the Dabbs house. He rides all the way back. Okay. Then he comes back to Richmond with his army. And he's tired. He writes his wife Anna that he's sick. So he's off his game. The orders he gets aren't always clear, and they don't have good maps. So when he comes down, okay, he's going to go to Pole Green Church. And again, I don't get too ahead of the story, so stop me if I do. But Pole Green Church near Beaver Dam Creek, he's 3 miles from the battlefield when AP Hill attacks. He can hear AP Hill attacking. He doesn't know where the roads are. And the orders were that DH Hill is supposed to meet him at Pole Green Church. So he has poor orders. There's poor communication on his part and other people's part. And he's exhausted. So the first day of the 7 days campaign doesn't go well. He misses an opportunity to come in behind Porter and crush him. It's catastrophic, really, for the Confederacy. But a lot of things to blame. It's not all his fault. Some is. He held his army up for a day in traveling to Richmond to honor the Sabbath. Okay, I appreciate these religious, but you've cost a day in the timetable that was critical. So those kind of things are his fault. The maps aren't his fault. There aren't good maps in Richmond, right? Not his fault he's exhausted. It's not his fault he's sick. So I give him a pass in some areas, in some areas I don't.
You mentioned a second ago about how DH Hill was supposed to meet him at Pole Green Church. He's not there, so Jackson's
Right.
waiting. And I think it illustrates a key component of Jackson's command style, and that he expected people to obey the letter of the law. And when he is given the letter of the law, he tries to obey it in that same spirit, and it doesn't necessarily work out. When he's in the Valley and he's got these sort of suggestions from Lee about things he might be able to do, and he's got kind of free reign, he's got a much different attitude as a commander than he does when he's trying to follow the letter of the law when he comes under Lee's command.
Yeah, there's an argument that he's a much better commander on his own than he is under somebody else. I don't know how true that was, because Chancellorsville, he certainly was under Lee, certainly did well. But yeah, so
he did well until he didn't.
Well, yeah.
Well, and he also
I don't
does
wanna go that
well
far.
because to some extent he gets his way. I mean, he does get to do what he wants to do to some extent.
Right. Chris, also at Savage Station, which is a little further along in the story, he gets confusing orders, and it costs him an opportunity to crush the rear of the Union Army, because he gets orders to tell him to say he's going to watch the Chickahominy. So he sits there and watches the Chickahominy when the battle's rolling right across it. So, it's not, I think he's held back because he believes in following orders strictly.
Yeah. And that's sort of a different discussion too, but Lee is learning how to command that army for the first time in much the same way that
Yes, he is.
a lot of the missteps at Gettysburg are because Lee's trying to learn how to command that army with the command structure. So, a lot of that kind of trickles down. So Doug, let's go back to something you said a second ago about his exhaustion, and Sarah, you can chime in on this, but you said it wasn't his fault that he was exhausted and that he was sick. Tell me more about your feelings about that.
Well, he fought the Valley campaign, so he's naturally tired. He comes to Richmond to see Lee. He rides back to see Lee. He has to bring his army back again. It's over 50 miles each direction. I think he has to do those things. There's an interesting story of a local historian who owns a home out by Pole Green Church, who actually said that Jackson spent the night there on the 26th of June, and he never slept. He stayed up all night praying. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's the kind of man he was. He would spend a lot of time praying. He was, deeply religious. He spent a lot of time praying when what the army needed him to do was to rest. And maybe that's his fault. Okay, I'll buy that. All right. But other exhaustion, I think, is just natural from the campaign you just fought and then come into Richmond, bring those guys down to Richmond. You're going to be tired, and you really can't help getting sick. In the Chickahominy Swamp area, you're going to get sick. A lot of people got sick there, you know.
Sarah, what do you think about that?
I think the exhaustion definitely has to factor in. And as I was thinking about this discussion and the two Jacksons that we're talking about, I was thinking about a study that I read a while back, and it was making the comparison that if you're not getting enough rest and it continues in a cycle of not getting enough rest and you're under a lot of stress, you end up functioning as poorly as if you had been really drunk. And there's a bit of irony to that, because we know Jackson didn't like alcohol, but you think about these weeks of marching and fighting and planning. And I was reading something earlier this morning, and Jackson would go off on his own, you know, in the night in the Valley campaign, and people wouldn't know where he was, but he clearly was not resting. So we don't know how many hours of sleep he's getting at certain periods of time, but exhaustion has to be part of it. And is he to that point where he's in kind of brain fog by the time he gets to the 7 days? Another thing to think about, and I don't like it when we try to diagnose people with a medical condition or something and we don't know what's going on, or a mental health condition and we don't really know. I mean, this is 160 years ago, so we have to be really careful with this. But does Jackson have some insomnia? Is he not able to rest? Is he so keyed up with the adrenaline of command and the responsibilities and everything that he's not able to rest? So then we get the pious story of, oh, he was up all night praying. I don't want to compare myself to Jackson with this analogy by any means, but I know times where I've been under a lot of stress for multiple weeks at a time, whether it's running events or different things like that. It can be really hard to relax enough to sleep. And sometimes it just feels easier to stay up and keep working. Obviously, that's not good physically. But again, is Jackson thinking about that? There's a lot of medical things that we know now that they thought very differently about back then. So I think it's hard from 160 years later to know exactly what physical and mental state Jackson's in, but I think the Valley campaign contributes significantly. And then if he continues this pattern of pushing himself, and as Doug has pointed out, he's not resting, he's sick, all of these things, it has to factor in. And it's going to factor, I think, in his staff for sure, and probably with some of the men that he brings to the peninsula as well.
And I can
it's interesting, Chris. Interesting, Chris. There's another Confederate general that suffers from a similar thing we don't talk about much, but Magruder. He was pushing himself. He was nervous. He was up all night. He was on medicine, and he performed like he was drunk. He may have been. I don't think so, but he performed like that. And so it wasn't an unknown thing. The stress is incredible.
And I can certainly see from Jackson's point of view where he might be physically exhausted, but I've got to say my prayers tonight. I mean, that was a top priority for him. And so, figuring like, absolutely, I'm going to pray. We've got a big battle coming up. Got to absolutely say my prayers. God'll take care of me if I'm not getting enough sleep, and I would have been very much part of his mindset. But, today we know that if you don't get enough sleep, you do have very impaired cognitive abilities. It's part of Army protocols now, or military protocols now, that commanders have to, by orders, get enough sleep. And if they don't, they can be removed from command because they're not going to be operating at their top cognitive ability. I had a really interesting conversation about this with Jim Ogden down at Chickamauga a few months ago. And he was talking about this in the instance of William Rosecrans, who heading into the Battle of Chickamauga had been awake for some god awful like 72 straight hours or something. And so he put himself in this perilous position so that when the battle starts and he still doesn't sleep, he's basically punch drunk because he's exhausted. And it was really Rosecrans's responsibility to make sure he was getting rest that he didn't get. So Jim was pretty hard on Rosecrans for being exhausted because Rosecrans had the ability to do something about it and didn't, pushed himself, and that then had some pretty dire results. And I could see the same sort of thing happen with Jackson here, where he's pushing himself, thinking that, oh, we'll skate by, or God will take care of me, whatever the case might be. And then just being absolutely in a fog, as you guys have both talked about.
And that's one of the key factors for his performance. And again, like I said before, there are other factors. There's poor orders, unclear orders, and there's really bad maps. Yeah. So they also played into it.
So, Doug, let's explore that just a little bit, because I asked Sarah to sort of start us off by talking about the high of Jackson in the Valley. Let's talk about the low of Jackson in the 7 days. I probably would pin White Oak Swamp as the low, but
low.
The 7 days, not a stellar time for Jackson. Tell us about that.
It seems to get worse every day. So first, on the 26th, he doesn't go around the Union flank like he's supposed to. And there's excuses, we talked about that might be valid. Then it gains Mill. The next day, he is supposed to go around the flank to Cold Harbor. And a guide takes him to, little did he know, there's an old Cold Harbor and a new Cold Harbor. And it takes him to New Cold Harbor. So his troops are late getting into action. Then at Savage Station, which is 2 days later, he has an opportunity to crush the rear of the Union Army of 2 or 3 corps. And Lee expects him to come across. Magruder's supposed to attack, Eugene's supposed to attack, and Jackson's supposed to come across. The orders he receives were actually intended for Jeb Stuart and Richard Ewell, who are down at Bottoms Bridge, way to the east. And they said, watch out for a Yankee retreat down the peninsula, and Jackson will watch the Chickahominy. And a copy is given to Jackson. Okay, I'm supposed to watch the Chickahominy, right? So I'll stay right here. And when that's cleared up, it's too late to build a bridge and get over in time. So things aren't going well. But the really bad day that really cost the Confederacy the most was at White Oak Swamp. Jackson gets there. It's quite a long story, actually, so I'll try to cut to the chase. But he gets there. He's really tired. He needs to build a bridge. He sends some people out, including Wade Hampton. Hampton comes back with a great place. He tells them we could do this. We can roll up their flank. They're not paying any attention over here. Jackson sits down to eat and falls asleep. When he finally does wake up, he reportedly says, let's go to bed and wake up tomorrow and see if we can't do something. In the meantime, okay, Eugene and Holmes do nothing. Longstreet and A.P. Hill attack. Had Jackson come in on the Union rear, they might in fact have cut the McClellan's army in half and destroyed half of it. Didn't happen. Okay. I don't fault him too much for Malvern Hill, so I don't think that was really his fault.
And so nobody had a good day at Malvern Hill. no one on the Confederate side.
Nobody had a good day there. There was no shining star there. But I think that Glendale was one of Lee's greatest lost opportunities of the war. He felt it was. Douglas Southall Freeman said it was. Porter Alexander said it was. And I think a lot of that falls on Jackson. I also, one pass I'll give him is communications were terrible. Lee's got 7 staff officers. They don't use the cavalry effectively, and the terrain's really difficult to get around and talk to each other. So they're not communicating well at all. They don't have radios and everything and satellites like we do today. So his communications are rough. So was he clear that he was supposed to come across and attack? It's questionable, but it's an obvious thing. If you're chasing a guy, you probably stop at the river.
Yeah, and one thing you pointed out when you and I were out touring the battlefields, working on your book, Richmond Shall Not Be Given Up. You talk about Richmond sort of being the center of spokes of a wheel, and the roads coming in and out are like those wheel spokes. And so there are not a lot of roads connecting the spokes necessarily. So when you talk about the roads being bad and stuff, there are not a lot of ways to get around in that area, because most of the roads are coming in and
roads
out.
Coming out, the spokes of the wheel, if you will, were okay. The other roads were pretty terrible. They were backcountry roads. They had conflicting names. Like, Magruder suffered going down a different Quaker road than the Quaker road Jackson went down. Okay, that's the kind of thing you're running into out there. So, and lack of maps was killing them. So it's almost inexcusable there weren't good maps.
Yeah. How long have they been in Richmond? Yeah, for sure. So Sarah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So Sarah, I asked Doug to tell me what he thinks of when he thinks of Jackson in the Valley. So I'll ask you, what do you think of when you hear Jackson in the 7 days?
Generally Jackson falling asleep. Jackson not taking initiative on orders, interpreting them very literally, which is something that he kind of does in those situations. But at the same time, yeah, I come back to wondering, if he had that focus that he had in the valley, would he have taken a look at those orders, taken the initiative to ask Lee, hey, I see an opportunity, should I do this? Or would he have just done it? But because something's going on, and those of us here in this call are thinking Jackson is exhausted, he's not taking initiative. So thinking of Jackson on around Richmond in the 7 days battles, I see a commander who's won a brilliant campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, and yet he's so worn down that he's not able to function well into the next one.
So, and I think too, like, he performed so poorly in the 7 days that it's a good thing Robert E. Lee knew of his work in the Valley, because I think that's what keeps Jackson from suffering the same sort of fate as Magruder or Theophilus Holmes, where, Lee shuffles out the guys he doesn't like who perform poorly after the 7 days. And Jackson
I was absolutely going there. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about
Lee
that.
wants people who are aggressive. He wants people who are aggressive. Jackson's showing no aggressiveness. He likes A.P. Hill. He likes Longstreet. They're aggressive. He tolerates D.H. Hill because he's aggressive, although he is a complainer. But Jackson, he has seen in the Valley. So he knows Jackson can fight. Mm-hmm. So he gives him a pass, I think. There's nowhere have I seen a word of criticism from Lee about Jackson's performance. I've scoured and scoured. I don't see a word of criticism about it.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's very Lee, who tended to not slap people critically in those sorts of
Unless
ways.
you're D.H. Hill.
Yeah. And there again, he eventually gets reassigned too. I mean, that's Lee's way to solve his problems. He just sends people away.
Send them away. Yep.
Well, it's interesting to consider too, looking beyond the 7 days and the next kind of big action that happens. Lee sends Jackson to go try to stop John Pope, who's heading down through central Virginia. So is Lee kind of maybe thinking, I'll give Jackson a chance here, see if he can perform again the way he did in the Valley? And it's kind of interesting to look at how the Cedar Mountain battle unfolds, and then it goes right into that Second Manassas campaign, and we see Lee coming up with Longstreet while Jackson's off doing these maneuvers that are coordinating with Lee and Longstreet, but yet Jackson's operating independently and again doing a pretty decent job.
Yeah. I was thinking
in response to that, I think there's a lot of truth to it, but you got to consider Lee's position when McClellan goes to the river. Pope is coming down. Who can he trust? He's got three people he can maybe trust: Longstreet, Jackson, and A.P. Hill. And A.P. Hill is just too new. He was just made a division commander in May. So he's just too new to handle that. And he's got issues too, right? He gets in fights with Longstreet and Jackson. I think he sends Jackson, much for the same reason she does. He's also aggressive. I think Longstreet's stalwart. He has an aggressive streak too. But I think he sends Jackson because he works well on his own. He thinks well on his own, as he proved in the Valley. So that was the right guy to send. Yeah. Just my opinion.
I think of a football analogy where we're sending Jackson deep downfield, and then he, Lee's the quarterback that can hit him with that long ball, and Jackson makes the big play. And so he goes off to Cedar Mountain. He goes off to Second Manassas. And in Antietam, everybody sort of has a tough time on the Confederate side. And then afterwards, Jackson gets sent back down in the Valley, even though Lee keeps the rest of the army on the east side of the Blue Ridge. And so, Jackson again has that opportunity to work independently. Going into the Fredericksburg campaign, when Lee finally recalls Jackson, he sends him down toward Port Royal. And so, he's stretched out over a 25-mile front. So still lots of latitude for independent action in all the things that he's doing as the war continues.
I think that's what he needed. I just really get the impression he doesn't function that well under strict orders. I think he needs some latitude. Even at Chancellorsville, he had some latitude. You take your corps, go around there and hit them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think he probably had some latitude, because how I was going to do that. I'm not an
Right.
expert at that battle. You are. So
And I think that's what Lee's recognizing and maybe giving Jackson kind of that second chance. Look, as we were talking about at the end of 7 days, that's what Lee's going for. I don't see it as Jackson punishing, or I'm sorry, Lee punishing Jackson by sending him away.
oh no,
So definitely not.
I think he was his only real choice to do it.
Yeah.
You know?
So as we've been talking here, a lot of focus on Jackson, but I want to go back to the wise words of George Pickett, who said, I think the Yankees had something to do with it. So Sarah, tell us about the federal command in the Valley. And Doug, I'll have you tell us a little bit about the federal command at the 7 days and how those sets of people also influence our story a little bit.
Mhm. So the commanders that we have in the Valley in the spring of 1862 are a really set of interesting personalities. Nathaniel Banks is going to be commanding one of the main armies, the one that's going to operate from Winchester and go into the central part of the Shenandoah Valley, then eventually retreat back to Winchester and toward the Potomac River after Jackson gets on his tail. But then we also have John Fremont operating off in like the area of the mountains of Western Virginia. He'll actually be in areas of West Virginia, but in 1862, we don't have West Virginia quite yet. And then we have General Sheeds. Am I saying that right? Shields, sorry. Shields coming in as well. And then of course, so some of these guys, some of the generals aren't the ones making the decisions on the battlefields either. Sometimes it's their subordinates. So we see lower ranking commanders like Milroy, like Carroll at Port Republic, making these types of decisions on battlefields that are going to have effects. And sometimes the Union commanders of that army unit are not as involved as we would think. Sometimes those lower ranking generals or officers are making decisions that influence the battlefield as well. So we're not even a complete year into the war yet. And both sides are still figuring out, how does command work? Who are good commanders? What does a good commander look like? In theory, some of them know from books, and some of them are also going to come to it very naturally. But in the Valley campaign, I think these Union forces are still trying to come up with, how does command work? How do we operate effectively in campaign on the battlefields? And also how to coordinate attacks, because you have 3 different forces or 3 different armies operating separately on different areas, different points of the Valley. And sometimes it really looks like they're coordinating great. And then Jackson will make a move that will take them by surprise, and their grand plan falls to pieces, or at least has to be revised really quickly. And I think it was Doug who pointed out the slow communications of this time. It's not pick up the phone or send a text message that, oh, Jackson's coming my way. It's a long route, and telegraph doesn't always work real great in the Shenandoah Valley. You got cavalry on both sides operating around, looking to cut off messengers, looking to cut communication lines. So I think the short answer, to kind of boil it back down, is Union troops in the Shenandoah Valley, the troops are ready for a fight. The troops want to fight, the soldiers on the ground. The generals, the officers are still figuring out what that needs to look like in the campaign and then actually on the battlefields as well.
I think on paper, you've got some people who are, they at least look like they're big names, John Fremont, the Pathfinder, and Nathaniel Banks, a former Speaker of the House, and Milroy, the War Eagle, like these sound like they should be a pretty decent lineup. And in the moment, hindsight tells us something a little differently. Doug, tell us about the federal leadership during the 7 days.
I think the federal leadership gets a bad rap a lot of times, and I'm not talking about McClellan. I'm talking about some of the corps commanders and division commanders and brigade commanders. McClellan, we all know about, obviously afraid to lose, and does a decent job of changing his base, if you will, his retreat to the James. But it's Porter who holds the Confederates off at Gaines Mill for a day and buys them time. It's Porter who grabs Malvern Hill and sets it up, right? Sets the position up as a good base. At Glendale, McClellan has gone off to the river looking for a new place for his army to camp when Lee is right on his heels. Okay? The army is spread out Units are disorganized. You've got the 4th Corps mixed with the 2nd Corps, the 3rd Corps broken up in 2 different places, the 5th Corps in different places. There's no chain of command and no one left in command, and yet they pull off a masterful defensive job at Glendale. And at Malvern Hill, they pull off a masterful defensive job. So they don't get, we always talk about the Confederates because, it's a pretty glorious story, right? But Union troops fought well and hard, and the Union leadership in many cases was very good. They saved the Army to me. And they even wanted to, I don't know how many people know, but they urged McClellan to attack after Malvern Hill because they thought they just cost the Confederates 5,000 casualties. Let's attack and take Richmond now. We've got them where we want them. So,
it was incredible when you and I were touring the battlefields and you're like, and here's a place where Porter saved the Army on this day. Oh, and here's the place where Porter saved the Army on that day. And his big crime is that he was friends with McClellan, and that's why he ends up. But imagine how things may have played out differently if Porter had actually stayed in command and stayed with the Army past Second Manassas, because he is an exceptionally capable commander on the field, I think.
Yeah. He might have commanded the Army one day. We'll never know.
Yeah.
Right.
So you mentioned the troops a second ago. So let's talk about the armies. We're sort of focused on Jackson doing this, Jackson doing that. What does Jackson's army look like in the Valley versus what does his army look like when he links up with Lee during the 7 days?
Sarah, Sarah take the Valley, and I'll take.
Sure.
So Jackson's army in the Valley, they're fairly well provisioned at the beginning. They're going to have some, and that's one of the things that Jackson is strict with. He wants his troops to have supplies. They're not always going to have them on those really long forced marches, but Jackson tries to keep supplies with his troops. So that's important to keep in mind. There is enthusiasm in the ranks. Basically from the end of March on through the Valley campaign, a lot of the troops are really upset that Winchester gets abandoned at the beginning of the campaign around March 11th, 1862. A lot of the men who are under Jackson's command are from the Shenandoah Valley, so they don't understand why they would be abandoning, or it looks like they're abandoning, one of the key cities in the lower part or the northern part of the Shenandoah Valley. So Jackson kind of has to work through some of that with his troops, but his troops continue to stay in ranks, continue to come to these battlefields. They're there, their enthusiasm grows as they have victories, but this does not mean they always love Jackson or can figure out what he's doing. And it also does not mean that they're all together as cohesive units all the time. When we read accounts, the primary sources written in what I call real time, so we're talking about diaries, letters written immediately after, those sorts of things, we hear about men falling out of ranks and units that are disorganized. I think about the push that Jackson does to recapture Winchester, and that does happen on May 25th, 1862. But in this massive drive that Jackson's doing along multiple roads at great speed, his troops are falling out of ranks. He gets enough to Winchester to fight the battle, to send Union General Banks on his way toward the Potomac. But there's a lot of stragglers back there, and that's something to keep in mind. Like, how far have these guys marched? What's unit strength when they actually get to a battlefield? Things like that are important to keep in mind. But yet through this, the men who keep returning to their units, who stay with Jackson and their army, they are being in some ways physically conditioned. This is like Jackson's the best, worst personal trainer who ever existed for these guys. So aside from being exhausted, they are going to be in pretty good physical condition when they get to the Chickahominy. I'll throw it to Doug here in just a second. One thing I do want to point out, Jackson's artillery performs pretty well in the Shenandoah Valley, so that's a good thing to keep in mind. If you're studying the battles individually, see how he uses the artillery and where he places it. Sometimes he's placing it personally, which may not be the best use of the commanding general's time and efforts, but Jackson loves artillery and he likes to go play with it. We do have to talk about the cavalry, though. Jackson has problems with the cavalry, and that might sound sacrilegious to say, because for most of the Valley campaign, it's under command of Turner Ashby, who, again, he's one of those rising heroes in the Valley's Confederate pantheon. He
Yeah, in fact,
died.
when you said his name, we had listeners that crossed themselves.
Oh, okay.
Because he still holds that.
Particularly those who either have studied the Valley a lot or who might live in the Valley. I was surprised at how popular Turner Ashby is. Ashby's very gallant. He's very dashing. He's kind of like Jackson in that he can operate really well when he has the initiative, but he doesn't always, unlike Jackson in later military movements, he doesn't always have that intuition of where he should be or what he should be doing. So Ashby causes trouble for Jackson in the campaign, and Jackson actually calls him out on it. So keep in mind, as we look at the campaign, we've got infantry going through a lot, but ultimately keeping ranks in Jackson's army. We have cavalry that's problematic, and Jackson even writes about it. And we have artillery that's doing pretty good. So we've got units that have been through 6 pitched battles. They're battle tested, the majority of them. If they weren't exhausted, they're in pretty good physical condition. They still have supplies, thanks to a lot of the supplies they capture from the Union troops themselves in the Shenandoah Valley. They're going to be heading toward Richmond, probably with more than they started off with in March as far as soldiering gear goes. Doug?
I'll give it to Doug in just a second, but I got to go back and talk about Turner Ashby for a second, because this is, I think, a real issue for Jackson. And you talk about him being gallant, and I think of Jeb Stuart and sort of fitting that mold. But I always think of Turner Ashby's like, we got a fraternity made up of lumberjacks and gold panhandlers. And we elected their president the chief of our cavalry, and that's Turner Ashby. Yeah. And it's like, that's a problem for Jackson.
Yes, but at the same time, Ashby wants to be the Knight of the Valley. He wants to really live up to that title. So he doesn't always look the part. He doesn't always act the part by any means. I mean, he kind of, he's fighting with the Bowie knives at the beginning of the war in 1861, but it's interesting. And of course, memory is going to have a lot to do with that once he's killed. June 6th, right? 1862. Yep. Yeah, down by Harrison, or up by Harrisonburg.
By the Pennsylvania Bucktails.
Yes.
A little bit of trivia for us today.
There's a really good book. I'm going to throw a book recommendation out here, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the author's name, but the book is called Blood Image, and it looks at Turner Ashby's life, and then it looks at how he was viewed in his time and how he was viewed in memory after his death and after the war. It's a really fascinating book if you're interested in Turner Ashby or in Confederate memory and that sort of thing. It's called Blood Image.
So, and one last point before I have Doug kind of chime in here too, and you talk about Jackson kind of wearing these guys down and working them hard, and a lot of them are grumbling and falling out and cussing. Everybody later loved to say they were part of Jackson's foot cavalry, but as you pointed out, at the moment they weren't necessarily so enamored by the idea.
That's like being part of Patton's army.
Yeah. So
I was
Doug,
having the Third Army. I don't think
yes, I was with Patton. Not glad about it at the time. So Doug, what's the army look like when Jackson marches them all over there, takes a train and marches partway over there to Richmond for the 7 days? What's the army he's fighting with there?
Well, the first problem is he doesn't tell anybody what's going on. So even Richard Ewell doesn't really know what's going on, who's number 2. Okay, that's a bit of a problem. All right. Communication is never a strong point with Jackson. He keeps everything to himself. But the army stretches out over 17 miles on its way to Richmond. So it takes a long time to get there. They go partway on train and partway on foot and partway on train, partway on foot. But they get to Richmond and they do a credible job. I mean, they fight hard at Gaines Mill. They join up with D.H. Hill. So Jackson's got somewhere around 18,000 men. The estimates really vary. And D.H. Hill's got about 10,000 men. So he's got like a mini army at this point, okay, which will last until White Oak, right? His men fight hard when they have the opportunity to fight. They fought hard. I mean, Gaines Mill, Richard Ewell attacked at Gaines Mill, by the way, is a new piece of land saved where Ewell attacked at Gaines Mill, saved by the trust. He attacked hard at Gaines Mill. Of course, everybody knows about John Bell Hood attacking at Gaines Mill and breaking through. He was with Jackson. So they fought hard. They fought well. Didn't get a chance to fight at White Oak, unfortunately. And D.H. Hill carried most of the weight at of that group carried most of the weight at Malvern Hill. Sarah talked about his artillery. Didn't really come into a great play during the campaign, particularly at Malvern Hill, when they kept trying to bring guns up and Jackson was help sighting them. But the the way the Confederate guns came up, they were all mostly assigned to brigades. There was a small general reserve, but generally they were assigned to brigades. So the brigades march up and the guns follow them. So the guns have to get to the front. As the guns get to the front, the Union guns on the hill just start smashing to pieces. So they really weren't that effective. But on the whole, I think his men did well when they had the opportunity to do well.
I have two more questions for each of you before we wrap up. The first one is this. So after the 7 days, is Jackson from there through Chancellorsville, is he more like the Valley Jackson or is he more like the 7 days Jackson? Sarah?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I would say once he gets beyond the 7 days, he goes back to being more like Valley Jackson. I do think he is trying to temper that at times. He starts trying to work with Lee, to coordinate with Lee at certain points in different campaigns. But I think ultimately we see him go back more to Valley Jackson. And as we talked about earlier, I think Lee is willing to unleash him at times. And that might be at a long distance or maybe a shorter distance. But Lee's trust in Jackson grows. And he's willing to use Jackson in those ways. So I say more of Valley Jackson.
I absolutely agree with Sarah on that. I don't see the 7 days Jackson coming back really. I think it's definitely more the Valley Jackson.
But and again, we're talking about the Valley Jackson as if that's some monolithic thing. But like, if we're including Kernstown as part of the Valley campaign, which Sarah has been doing tonight, that's a different Jackson than the Jackson that we see at Cross Keys and Port Republic, or the Jackson that's threading the needle going into Strasburg. Those are different Jacksons too. Before I forget, the book that Sarah had mentioned a second ago, Blood Image, Turner Ashby in the Civil War and the Southern Mind. Paul Christopher Anderson is the author of that. So, all right. So what have I not asked the two of you that I should have asked tonight? Or what's something you wanted to get into the conversation that we haven't gotten to? Sarah?
I'd like to kind of throw this out here as both a closing, and it's also something that maybe we could explore on the blog or in a future podcast. I think it's important to look at who Jackson picks to put on his staff. And he has some really good picks and he has some not so great picks. And in the Valley campaign, he's still experimenting with having a minister as chief of staff. And that's Robert Dabney. Doesn't work out so well. A lot of other people are covering or doing the work for Dabney.
Much like the chief of artillery for the Army of Northern Virginia.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. So I think it's interesting to look at the Valley campaign, to look at the 7 days and see what Jackson's staff is doing to contribute to his success, where they're also standing back confused. They don't even know what to do. They don't know where to take the initiative. And then also some of them end up pretty sick down once they get around Richmond. So again, it can't be the single thing that contributes to Jackson's problems, but it's something to look at. How is his team, the team that's behind him, so to speak, how is it either functioning well or falling apart? And how does Jackson push these guys maybe too hard? Maybe he frustrates them. His quartermaster, it's a Harmon. I think it's John A. Harmon.
Yep.
He throws up his hands a few times in the Valley campaign and resigns over Jackson saying something. I mean, they were both being a little petty, but Harmon's gonna pack up and go home, and then Jackson has to go over and be like, "Hey, I'm sorry," and there's some incidents with Hunter McGuire where, he's trying to avoid Jackson for a little while because they've done something that irritates each other. And it's also it's this testing, it's this challenge, these successes, and it's Jackson pulling together a staff that's also going to contribute to his successes later in 1862 and 63.
The explosively profane John Harmon. And I think it goes to show just how much Jackson appreciated Harmon's abilities and the importance of logistics, that
Yes.
that Jackson actually would go to Harmon and be like, no, listen, I really kind of need you here. And normally he wouldn't put up with that kind of stuff, but he does from Harmon. So Doug, what have I not asked you, or what do you want to get in before we wrap
I think
up?
you covered it pretty well, but the one thing I do want to emphasize in Jackson's defense, and it is the poor communications in the Army of Northern Virginia at the time. Again, no one's led armies like this before. And Lee certainly hasn't led an army like this before. And he has just been thrown in at the last minute, right, to save Richmond. But Jackson gets orders that aren't always clear. And there's not a good use of cavalry and communicating between units. And I think sometimes, like at Beaver Dam Creek or Gaines Mill, the use of cavalry to communicate and hunt each other down might have been beneficial to clarify orders and what are you doing now and why aren't you doing this now, and the intent is this, okay? The words say this, but the intent is this, okay? And you can't get that from a little piece of paper. So I think communications could have been a lot better, and that gets learned later. And I think that hurts Jackson, but he's also a poor communicator. So communications is critical.
Mm-hmm.
I think something else that works against Jackson in 7 days is everyone sort of looks at, Manassas and the Valley Campaign, and then, Cedar Mountain and Second Manassas, and he's got all the string of victories. And so within that big string, the 7 days looks like a pretty poor performance, but I think it's a discredit, because if we really parse some of that open, it's early enough in Jackson's career that there's still lots of up and downs, because yes, there's Manassas, but then there's the Romney campaign, and there's Kernstown, and then there's the rest of the Valley campaign, and so there's actually a lot more up and down going on in that early part of his career than a lot of people, I think, realize. And so the 7 days
Chancellorsville is a great. Chancellorsville is heroic, but what if he hadn't been shot and did keep on attacking? What might have happened?
Oh yeah, disaster! Disaster awaits. So,
right.
We're here in the season recording this podcast as Jackson's making his shift from the Valley to the 7 days. So it's on our minds as Civil War scholars 160 years ago right now. What a real treat to talk to the two of you and just kind of parse this out a little bit. I've had a great time tonight. Thank you both.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for asking, Sarah. Great to talk to you again.
Yes, same.
So, on behalf of my colleagues, Doug Crenshaw and Sarah K. Bierle, I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online and on the battlefield.